and his new job was in Water Tower. So they packed carefully. It took many days. First, Mr. Green had to pack 43 sets of false teeth. Then Mrs. Green had to pack her dancing shoes and her bathing suits. And Goonie Bird had to pack all of her belongings, which included a money collection. Finally, their furniture was loaded onto a moving van, and the Green family waved goodbye as the moving van drove away from China and started its journey to Water Tower. Goonie Bird stopped. Every child in the classroom had a hand raised, and even Mrs. Pigeon was waving her hand. "I'll have an intermission now for questions," Goonie Bird said. "Chelsea, yours first." "Why did Mr. Green have 43 pairs of false teeth?" Chelsea asked. "The false teeth are not part of the story," Goonie Bird said. "Malcolm?" Malcolm had looked up from his "I will not put anything in my newspaper." His eyes were very wide. "Tell about the money collection," he said. "That's another story," Goonie Bird said. "Beanie?" "When are you going to tell about the prince and the diamonds?" Beanie asked. Goonie Bird thought it over. "On Monday, I'll tell it," she said. "Now, there's time for one more question before I continue. Mrs. Pigeon, did you have your hand raised?" Mrs. Pigeon nodded. "Goonie Bird," she said in a nice voice, "you have an amazing imagination, and we think you are wonderful at telling stories. Don't we, class?" She looked around, and almost all of the children were nodding. But I want to be certain that the children understand that these are made-up stories. So I want to point out, my stories are all absolutely true, Goonie Bird said. "I want to point out," Mrs. Pigeon went on, "that of course we all know that China is a foreign country across the ocean, and that a moving van could never drive from China to Water Tower." Goonie Bird rearranged her pearls and sighed. "Mrs. Pigeon," she said, "why don't we take a few minutes for research? Is there an atlas on the bookcase?" Mrs. Pigeon laughed and said, "Of course." She went to the bookcase and took out a book of maps called an atlas. "Now," said Goonie Bird, "would you find out if there are other Chinas?" "Other Chinas?" "I don't think," Mrs. Pigeon began, turning the pages of the atlas. She found an index at the back. "My goodness," Mrs. Pigeon said after a minute, "there's a China in Texas." "Correct," said Goonie Bird. "And what else?" "There's a China in Maine." "Correct," said Goonie Bird. "And California. There's a China Lake. Oh, and my goodness, look, in North Carolina." "And now it is time to continue the story," Goonie Bird announced. "Where were we? Oh, yes, I remember. The moving van had just left China." She took up the story again. After the moving van left China, the Green family loaded up their station wagon with 5 big suitcases. Then they added a lawnmower that they had forgotten to put in the moving van, a cooler of ham sandwiches and iced tea, a bundled up stack of National Geographics, and an orange and white cat named Catman, who had no tail because he had flicked his former tail once under the lawnmower. The last thing they put into the station wagon was a rolled-up rug from the front porch of their house. It was too long to fit. They tried it sideways and folded and upside down, but it still wouldn't fit. "Let's leave it behind," Mr. Green suggested. But Mrs. Green began to cry. "It was my mother's," she said. "There's a stain on it where my mother spilled some black bean soup 40 years ago. I feel sentimental about this rug." So Mr. Green agreed to take the rug because it made him cry too if his wife cried. He decided to put the back window of the station wagon down so that the end of the rolled up rug could stick out. He made certain that everything was nicely arranged and that Catman had a comfortable place to sleep on the back seat, just beneath the end of the rug and next to the place where Goonie Bird would sit. Mr. Green and Mrs. Green and Goonie Bird Green all got into the car and drove away from China, starting their long journey to Water Tower. They drove for many, many hours. They ate all of the ham sandwiches and drank all of the iced tea. They stopped to get gas, they went to the bathroom, they played the car radio and listened to the news and operas and football games and talk shows about love and relationships. Suddenly, Goonie Bird glanced down and noticed with dismay that her beloved Catman had disappeared. She looked around the floor of the back seat, but Catman was not there. She heard a small sound like a purr coming from inside the rolled-up rug. She knew that Catman had entered the rug. He probably found it a warm and dark, cozy place. But Goonie Bird was worried about Catman. She decided to try to get him out. She reached into the rolled-up center of the rug, but he slithered away, beyond her hands. She looked at the back of her parents' heads, wondering if she should tell them about the problem with Catman. But her mother was dozing and her father was driving, watching the road carefully and listening to the radio program about whales. So Goonie Bird decided to wiggle into the rug herself to rescue Catman. "Oh no," Kiko cried, "I'm going to faint." "Shh," the other children said. It was dark and dusty and very tight squeeze inside the rolled-up rug. But Goonie Bird wiggled inch by inch towards Catman. Catman slithered away inch by inch. She could see his glittering eyes as he backed away from her hands. Goonie Bird was determined to rescue him. She continued forward. Suddenly, an amazing thing happened. Even though Goonie Bird was not very large and did not weigh very much, and was not wearing her heavy diamond earrings from the palace that day, her weight inside the rolled-up rug caused it to tilt. At that moment, Mr. Green leaned forward to change the radio station, and the car went over a pothole in the road. The rolled-up rug containing both Catman and Goonie Bird slid out of the back of the station wagon and flew through the air before it landed on the side of the road. In some thick grass beside the fence post. A cow chewing a purple flower looked curiously at it and then wandered away. The station wagon drove on around a curve in the road. Slowly, the rug unrolled. Catman's fur was standing on end. As if he had a tail, his tail would have been sticking straight up in the air. For a moment, Catman stood still, looking at Goonie Bird. Then he ran away very fast. Goonie Bird sat up. She was not entirely sure what happened, but she was not hurt. She simply wondered where her family was, and her cat, and the car. Other cars stopped and people got out. Many people offered her a drink of water from their bottles of Evian. But Goonie Bird wasn't thirsty. After a while, a police car with a flashing light came. A TV reporter came, and a cameraman. While the policeman talked on his radio, the TV reporter and a woman with very large hair interviewed Goonie Bird and called her the little girl who had a flying carpet ride. In the interview, Goonie Bird describes Catman and asked people to call the station if they'd found him, but she never got Catman back. Eventually, the police car took her to her parents, who were both crying at the gas station 4 miles down the road. When Goonie Bird and her parents were finally reunited, everyone, including the 2 policemen, a TV reporter, and the gas station owner, hugged and kissed and did the tango. The end. What a lovely story, Mrs. Pigeon said, and an exciting one, too, but a little sad to lose your kitty that way. Catman is not a kitty, Goonie Bird said. He is a cat, and I didn't say that I lost him. I just said that I never got him back. So no one found him and called the TV station? Actually, they did, Goonie Bird replied. But where is Catman now? Asked Mrs. Pigeon. That's a different story. Mrs. Pigeon asked if she was joking. She said, "No," said Goony Bird, "I am not joking. I tell only absolutely true stories." Tell it," the children called. "I will," Goony Bird said. "Another day." The end.